For decades, Bernard Baras has argued that the scientific study of consciousness is possible. Why does he think mainstream psychology resisted his argument?
Well, I think why Bernard Baras thought mainstream psychology resisted his argument, well, first off, because psychologists back then in the 18th, 19th century, such as William James, he thought consciousness was a fundamental problem. It was a fundamental problem for psychology, but he had little to say on the subject of consciousness. And so psychologists took the reality of consciousness, they took it to be so obvious that they took it for granted. And it couldn't be doubted or explained. They just left it closed-minded, period, blank. That's it. And others, such as Fred and thinkers of psychodynamic tradition, had much to say of unconscious motives, but took the conscious experience for granted as well. So it's just been avoided because consciousness is so simple, because we're all awake, we're all conscious, you know what I'm saying? And it's just like, it's been recently, these last 2 decades, that we explored Bernard's theory, or his question, his hypothesis of consciousness. And so that's why mainstream psychologists back then, until recently, avoided the subject.
Imagine driving your car on a familiar route and on one that's unfamiliar. To what extent is consciousness involved in each task, and what is its function?
Well, when driving your car on a familiar road, your mind shifts into an unconscious state of mind, almost as if you're not thinking at all because of habit. This state of mind allows you to think about things besides the route while still getting yourself to your destination. When you're driving on a road, whereas a route you are unfamiliar with would require a very conscious and alert state of mind, focusing on details such as making correct turns or driving the right speed. For example, driving to high school last year was a piece of cake for me. I could almost do it in my sleep. I knew the route so well that I didn't have to think about it, and oftentimes I would find myself thinking about what I was going to have for lunch or what tests I had to do that day instead of focusing on the road. And when I was driving to PUC this year on an unfamiliar road, I had to pay attention to every little detail, which turns to take, which stops were coming up, and so on and so forth. So that's a much more conscious state of mind.
Can you give me an example of consciousness?
A couple examples of consciousness would be when you first learn to play something, or when you first learn to do anything. Like, when I first learned to play the guitar, I was very conscious about what I was doing. I had to think about where to place my fingers, when to change, shift into different chords. I had to think about everything. And after a while of playing, it became a very unconscious effort because I didn't have to think about anything. I didn't have to say, oh, where should I put my fingers now? I just did it. I didn't have to think about it at all. And sometimes when I did think, oh, how did I do that? While I'm playing, I mess up, and I don't understand why, because it's just so unconscious. If I put too much thought into it, I mess up. Another example would be when I first learned to drive. At first you're really conscious of what you're doing. You're always thinking, when do I put on my turning signal? Oh, should I press the gas now? Should I brake? Those kinds of things. But once you practice, you really don't have to think about it. It's so easy. You don't think, oh, let me put on my turning signal. You just do it automatically. And another example would be when you first learn to type. Like, when you're first learning, you probably just use 2 fingers, and you're always looking at the keyboard and type your words. But once you practice, you don't even have to look down. Like, you think of a word, you type it automatically. You're not putting so much thought into it. You don't have to always look down and take it one step at a time. So those are some examples of consciousness.
Explain why Daniel Wagner, in his technical writings, calls the strategies that people use to control their own minds ironic processes.
In his studies of thought suppression, Wagner found that when you're trying to suppress a thought, you actually think about it more. This effect is known as the rebound effect. You may try to repress a thought in your mind, but your mind is going two separate processes. One is a operating process that searches for something else to think about, while another process, an automatic monitoring process, searches for or looks for the unwanted thought. The irony in all of this is that the monitoring process increases your sensitivity to the unwanted idea, making it more likely to return. Say you pass Baskin Robbins. You're like, I really want ice cream. You're like, no, can't have ice cream, can't have ice cream. But then you, say you see like a triangle shape, kind of looks like an ice cream cone. Then you're reminded of it. And you're like, I want ice cream.
What lessons does research on unwanted thoughts have for people who are concerned about their weight and are considering dieting?
Research on unwanted thoughts has taught us that thought suppression can be superficially effective. What this means is that people can keep things out of mind briefly or intermittently. However, this habit of thought suppression is usually ineffective in the long run, because it causes thoughts to come back stronger and more often. Someone concerned with their weight and attempting to diet would probably struggle with cravings, and if they tried to suppress their cravings, they would most likely end up giving in to them because the cravings would come back stronger. Constantly falling for their cravings would cause them to quit their diet and give up. To successfully diet, the best lesson would be to confront their cravings and getting comfortable with the fact that cravings will occur, especially while they diet. The best way to overcome unwanted thoughts is to face them head on, even when it's not easy, and to familiarize oneself with unwanted thoughts and the feelings they provoke, in order to no longer fear the thoughts.
Can you please give me an example of thought suppression when you put things out of your mind but they just wouldn't go away?
So, I think the most common example that everyone could relate to, I guess, would have to be a breakup. Everyone's had a boyfriend or girlfriend sometime in their life, and if not, they'll know later on. But I had a breakup with my boyfriend of 2 years, and it was the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. And it just seemed like every time I was just like walking to class or sleeping, he would pop up in dreams just randomly, or like walking to class, I would just have an idea of him in my head. And it seemed like the harder I tried to suppress like the thought of him, it seemed to pop up more and more. And I guess you can't really suppress something that you've experienced. You can't forget something that you've done. And I guess it was just a hard experience.
How did you get over that, since it's so hard you just couldn't forget?
I never got over it. You can't get over it. It's, like I said, something you've experienced. You can't forget about it, no matter how hard you try.
Have you ever had another experience in your life where you've experienced thought suppression and it didn't work?
Yes, my horse last year passed away. He was the first horse I've ever owned. I had him since a baby. He was the first horse I ever rode. And after he passed away, it's hard when you lose someone. Like, I can't just go out in my pasture and get on him and go. No, now I have to find another horse to ride. And like riding another horse, I think of him, the great rides we went on. And I don't know, you can't forget